introduce myself briefly to start with. I'm a mother, I'm a communication skills trainer and author, and I've worked in schools and with teachers and with parents for nearly 20 years. I set up Transgender Trend over 3 years ago in response to parents' concerns about this issue. I see the devastating impact of gender identity ideology on parents and families just about every day. I hear from parents who are being told that their teenage daughters are now literally their sons because of their gender identity, who watch as the whole world tells their daughter she's brave, while they are called transphobic bigots for not wanting their daughter to get her breasts cut off or take hormones which will have serious and irreversible effects on her body, for not wanting her set up for a lifetime of health problems, a lifetime as a medical patient, and probably a shortened lifespan. For wanting to know where the evidence is for a treatment so drastic, which may leave her infertile with uterine and vaginal atrophy, leading to hysterectomy further down the line, the possibility of excruciating pain during orgasm, surgical complications if she decides on a phalloplasty, leading to incontinence in around 50% of cases. And that's quite apart from the increased risk of various cancers. I hear from parents terrified that their Barbie and princess-loving little boy will be led to believe that he was born in the wrong body and that he's really a girl. I hear from parents whose child has already begun questioning if they're really a boy or a girl after hearing a transgender presentation in primary school. I hear from parents who say that other parents are already asking if their short-haired, jeans-wearing little girl is transgender, and fear that she will sooner or later pick up on this message that somehow she's not really a girl. And I hear from mostly young women who regret, and mostly lesbians, who regret their medical transition and the resulting disfigurement of their bodies, and are angry that no adult, including teachers and clinical professionals, ever told them that you can't actually change sex, that they'd been set up to believe a myth. When I was a child, I believed I was a boy. I was persistent, consistent, and insistent throughout my whole childhood, which is the sign that you are really trans. This went on well into adolescence, when I tried to prevent myself from becoming a woman through all the usual means: self-harm, anorexia, bulimia, depression. I'm now the mother of 4 children, and I shudder to think that if I was growing up today, not only would I be diagnosed with gender dysphoria, but I would be judged an extreme case. I would have jumped at the chance to take puberty blockers to stop me developing into something I believed I was not. And I never wanted children anyway. I've heard very similar stories from so many women and from gay and lesbian adults. So we need to be very, very cautious of promoting the idea to children that your identity is the reality and that your body is some kind of inconvenient mistake. This is a model of understanding which says that your true self is split off from your body and exists in opposition to it. It's a model which not only validates body hatred and rejection, but recasts this as heroic and brave. A mind-body split, or disassociation from the body, would under any other circumstances be recognised as harmful to a child's mental, psychological and physical well-being. But we've seen a massive political movement over the past few years, and everything has changed. It's seemingly in the blink of an eye, we've gone from what was viewed as a child who presents with gender dysphoria as a transgender child. And in this move, we've politicised both the child and a childhood clinical condition. A child with gender dysphoria may be helped and supported. The transgender child becomes an emblem for a social justice and political rights movement. Children affected by gender dysphoria should not be used to further any political agenda or provide proof of any ideology. We need to take great care to separate the two issues, both within the medical profession and in schools. We have a situation now where within the issue of political rights versus clinical care and safeguarding of children and young people, the waters have become very muddied indeed. The people who are providing professional training for both the NHS and teachers are not clinical or educational professionals, but highly funded lobby groups with very specific and extreme political goals. If you look at the schools training from Stonewall, Gendered Intelligence, Mermaids, Gyres, all sorts and others, you'll see that what they provide is a manifesto to change the world. Teachers are required to learn a whole new lexicon of words and ideological concepts. In a glossary of new genders, the words they don't define, the words conspicuous by their absence are boy, girl, man and woman. If you examine the school's guidance produced by transgender and LGBT groups, you start to see clearly that it's all about the blurring of sexual boundaries. Under the guise of diversity and inclusion, toilets, changing rooms and overnight accommodation become mixed sex, denying every child their right to privacy from the opposite sex and their right to their own boundaries. This raises huge safeguarding issues and questions about consent, and in particular girls' sex-based rights and protections. The establishment of mixed-sex facilities is one of the key campaign goals of the transgender movement, which essentially wants to replace sex with gender identity as the defining characteristic and distinction between men and women in culture and in law. But I want to focus on the other campaign goal of the transgender lobby, which is specifically about the treatment of children and young people. The same activists lobbying for demedicalisation for adults aggressively campaign for earlier and earlier medicalisation of children. The goal is to establish affirmation and social transition as the only legitimate approach to children who are suffering from gender dysphoria. Of course, a child with gender dysphoria who identifies as transgender must be fully accepted and supported in school, and that's not in question. Schools need robust anti-bullying policies and support measures in place. But when a child believes themselves to be the opposite sex, to immediately affirm them is to make an assumption of the outcome, and the outcome is something that none of us can predict. What we do know is that in around 80% of cases of prepubertal children, these feelings resolve naturally during puberty, and that being gay or lesbian as adults is by far the most likely outcome. So is this the new gay conversion therapy? Are we now transing away the gay? Because gender identity teaching is happening in primary schools long before children understand their sexuality or are taught about sexual orientation. Gender identity gets in first. The affirmation, social transition, puberty blockers path does not resolve gender dysphoria, and it does not intend to. Any therapeutic support for young people to help them with mind-body reintegration has been vetoed by activists as conversion therapy. Professionals are already voicing concerns that blockers lock children into an irreversible medical pathway. Over 90% of children who take blockers at the Tavistock Clinic progress onto cross-sex hormones. So the aim of affirmation and social transition is the opposite. Its very purpose is to keep a child in a state of gender dysphoria as trans. If trusted adults affirm a boy as a girl every day at home and at school and ensure that all his peers and everyone he comes into contact with also affirms him as a girl, you make it as unlikely as possible that his gender dysphoria will naturally resolve as it does in the vast majority of cases if we watch and wait. And teachers may be unaware that there is no consensus amongst the professionals on the affirmation approach towards children with gender dysphoria. In fact, more and more doctors are speaking out about their concerns. The established global clinical approach is watchful waiting. Unquestioning affirmation is an approach wholly driven by activists. It is not a neutral act of kindness and acceptance as it's presented, but an active reinforcement of a child's belief. It assumes the outcome is a foregone conclusion and actively influences the child towards that prescribed outcome. Social transition has already been found to be a predictor of persistence of gender dysphoria in a 2013 study by Dr. Thomas Steensma from the Amsterdam Gender Identity Clinic. And this should be obvious. Children are suggestible. They believe adults, and particularly adults in positions of authority, such as teachers. We're now expecting children to make fundamental decisions about taking hormone blockers and cross-sex hormones, drugs that will effectively sterilise them and change their bodies forever, before they're of an age and maturity to understand the long-term implications. In fact, the professionals don't know the long-term implications because this treatment is supported by no long-term research studies. Puberty blockers are promoted by transgender lobby groups as being fully reversible, but there are no studies to show this when they're used to treat gender dysphoria. The idea that blockers simply buy time for the child to decide is now being questioned by professionals who have expressed concerns that we are locking children into a medical pathway they will not come off, that blockers may in fact prevent the normal resolution of gender dysphoria. Over 90% of children on blockers at the Tavistock go on to cross-sex hormones, resulting in sterility. And the use of blockers is justified by activists based only on research on their use for precocious puberty. Using blockers during normal adolescence is completely different, as there is a window for pubertal development, and we don't yet know the long-term effects if this window of development is missed. Currently, studies are being conducted on sheep, and the results are concerning. Some cognitive functions, such as short-term memory, are impaired and do not improve if blockers are discontinued. Blockers were tested on children before they were tested on animals. And I think that's the only case in medicine where that is the case. And these results replicate the results of studies on men taking the drug for prostate cancer, which indicate risk of memory loss, depression, and cognitive impairment. One of the most worrying aspects of guidance, such as Stonewall's, is the casual normalisation of hormone treatments, which are referenced as lightly as changing clothes and changing pronouns. So to teach children that feelings in your head override biological reality is causing harm to vulnerable groups of children, those who are particularly susceptible to this new way of understanding themselves. Increasing numbers of young people who identify as transgender have pre-existing mental health problems, past trauma, or troubled backgrounds. A 2017 study found that 10% had suffered past sexual abuse. I heard from a mother once who told me that her daughter started identifying as a boy 2 weeks after she'd been raped. 35% of children referred to the Tavistock Clinic exhibit moderate to severe autistic traits. And of course we know that the vast majority of these teenagers transitioning are girls. Lisa Littman's study on rapid onset gender dysphoria found that 62.5% of these teenagers had been diagnosed with at least one mental health disorder or neurodevelopmental disability before the onset of gender dysphoria. So it's crucial that schools offer proper support to the most vulnerable young people, and all underlying factors must be considered as part of a school's safeguarding duties towards each individual child. Advice which forces teachers to collude in the unquestioning affirmation approach towards young people with gender dysphoria makes this impossible. As teachers in schools are being advised that a child's transgender status must not be challenged, many schools may be failing to consider whether there may be underlying symptoms of emotional abuse, trauma, mental health issues, or perhaps social contagion by online groups. Nearly 50% in Lisa Littman's study had increased social media use before coming out as trans. Rapid onset gender dysphoria, where an adolescent suddenly develops gender dysphoria with no signs of it in early childhood, is a completely new presentation. It's unprecedented. We don't even have a model of care for this cohort of children identifying as transgender. We have the model of watchful waiting for prepubertal children, but because rapid onset gender dysphoria is so new. We haven't developed yet a clinical model of care. Lisa Lippman's was the first study of this group, and activists tried to suppress it. The steep rise in mental health problems in teenage girls follows the same trajectory as referrals to the Tavistock, and in both cases the gender gap is widening. From 2011 to 2017, there's been a 68% rise in rates of self-harm among girls aged 13 to 16. Nearly 1 in 4 14-year-old girls has reported depressive symptoms in a study published the year before last. These girls become invisible within the unsexed category of transgender, and they are lost to research on the mental health condition of young women. The Stonewall published in 2017 a schools report about suicidal ideation, which covered up the fact that the vast majority of these young trans people who are suffering will be teenage girls. Our understanding moves from teenage girls are in crisis and we need to understand why, to trans kids are at high risk of suicide. Their finding was that more than 2 in 5 trans young people have attempted to take their own life. And this statistic has been used by policymakers and activists, in particular mermaids, to spread the idea that young trans people will commit suicide if not allowed to transition. The study itself has serious methodological flaws. For example, it's self-selected and it doesn't control for pre-existing mental health issues. It also doesn't control for whether the participants have already medically transitioned or not. So we can't use this study to extrapolate into the wider population, nor can we use it as proof that children are more likely to commit suicide if they're not allowed to transition. And yet, this fact is used to scare parents, which I think is the cruelest form of emotional blackmail of parents you could possibly come up with. So this suicide statistic is repeated as fact by organisations pushing for early transition, pushed by policymakers and quoted by politicians. A new Memorandum of Understanding on Conversion Therapy, which was published at the end of the year before last by the UK Council of Psychotherapies, included gender identity for the first time. And essentially this prevents any therapist or counsellor from helping a child to explore the underlying issues, because if a child subsequently desists, the counsellor risks being accused of conversion therapy. The memorandum in practice means that a therapist must be invested in one outcome only. They must validate a child's transgender identity and prevent a child from actually exploring the underlying issues that may be at play. So adolescents who identify as transgender are effectively placed outside safeguarding in schools, just as the new memorandum effectively places them outside normal duty of care protocol in treatment. And nowhere else in the medical profession is a model of affirmation and informed consent used, and that means where the doctor agrees with the patient's self-diagnosis and prescribes the treatment that the patient demands. So in schools, the 1989 Children Act states that the welfare of the child is paramount. The guiding principle of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is that we must act in the best interests of children. The Education Act 1996 protects children from political indoctrination by forbidding the promotion of partisan political views in the teaching of any subject in school. I believe that using the school's guidance by transgender and LGBT organisations without any other balancing material is in breach of the Education Act, and the policy of affirmation, unquestioning affirmation, is in breach of the Children Act and UN law. I wrote this alternative guide for schools because of my concerns that what we're seeing is schools being used as an arena for a political campaign. I think that is wrong. I don't think it serves the best interests of children. And if anybody would like a copy, please come and see me afterwards, and I've got copies that I can give you, or you can order them. Thanks very much.